Welcome back, everybody. We're doing a special federal election series on the Northern Sentinels podcast, and I'm speaking with different experts about Canadian national defense. And today, I'm fortunate to have retired Lieutenant General Stu Beare on the show to talk about a number of issues in his perspective. Stu, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you on.
Chris, it's great to be here. Thanks for all you're doing, my friend, connecting to the world and connecting the world to important issues.
Now, some listeners will absolutely know who you are, but others will not. So why don't you give them an idea of who you are and why you have the background to speak about things such as defense and deterrence in Canadian context?
Simply put, I'm a 36-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. My last appointment was to command Canadian Joint Operations Command, where we oversaw the planning and preparation for operations and the conduct of operations for the entire Canadian Armed Forces outside of NORAD in missions here at home and around the world. And I concluded that service in 2014. And so I had that time the opportunity to see the world as it was then, to understand Canadian defense policy as it was then, and participate in executing that policy through land, sea, air, maritime, space, and cyber operations at home and around the world.
So one of the things that we've spoken about recently was the idea of deterrence. And you know, you've started your career, you probably grew up in a military where deterrence was spoken about, and I did not. So it really hasn't, for the last number of decades since the end of the Cold War, been common lexicon in the Canadian military. And why do you think that we need to start thinking in terms of deterrence for Canada?
I think it's worth starting with a sort of shared description or definition of what deterrence can mean. It can mean different things to different people, but from a almost a dictionary perspective, deterrence means discouraging an act or event to instilling doubt or fear of the consequences. So we're really talking about discouraging, in this case, adversaries from acting or creating events that are to our detriment of Canada's national interests or national security. And we do that via instilling doubt or fear of the consequences of our actions in reactions to their threats in the minds of adversaries, and via our credible contribution to partners with whom we share that same deterrence interest. So if you think about deterrence in the age of post-World War II, it was clear that there were two major global powers in play, the West and the Warsaw Pact. And the dominant posture of the NATO forces up to the end of the 1980s was to deter Warsaw Pact military transgression into NATO areas of interest or NATO territories, and against NATO countries' interests. And we had essentially a period of 40 to 50 years of lived deterrence in the world, where the Warsaw Pact, the target of our deterrence effect, was effectively deterred from taking military action against the West. And the dominant part of that deterrence was their doubt or fear of the consequence of taking NATO on and the cost to the homeland, the Warsaw Pact homeland at that time, should they use conventional military force to advance their interests. So that's sort of what deterrence really means. And in the Canadian story of military or defense and security interests from the period of the Cold War to today changed dramatically in 1991 when we, quotations, won the Cold War. In some ways, we declared victory on our collective result of the Western investment in military capability, leading to the fall of the Warsaw Pact, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the journey towards what we would have called the peace dividend in the 1990s. So in some ways, the last time the word deterrence was used strategically at scale against a peer adversary at a global scale was really up to late 1980s, early 1990s. So today's public, today's political class, and even today's serving military class do not have a lived experience with dealing with peer power competition and preparing and mobilizing military force to actually being a strategic deterrent versus what we've seen over the last 3 decades as the dominant military. The purpose of our militaries in the last 3 or 4 decades has been to contribute to peace and security as the major contribution to government policy versus being postured to deter a peer adversary.
So, what are the results of that? So, if we haven't in the last 30 or 40 years looked at peer adversary, we haven't looked at deterrence, and what are the sort of shortcomings of the places we really need to invest to get ourselves back to a spot where the Canadian military is performing part of that deterrence role?
Yeah, I'd say I'll just do a quick sort of journey through 4 decades. If you contemplate the end of the Cold War, the 1980s to today, the 1980s were really characterized by Reaganomics, and the West invest in defense at scale to actually outspend the Warsaw Pact and to essentially break the will of the Warsaw Pact to sustain a massive military posture and persisting as a real threat, existential threat to the West. And so in those years, if you were to look at the Canadian Armed Forces, we were some 150,000 strong. We had land, sea, and air forces that were prepared for war. They had general defense plans for continental defense. They had general defense plans for maritime anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic and the Pacific. They had the forces deployed in Europe, air and land, to the tune of some 6,000 in the brigade and some several thousand in our air wing. And we were part of a NATO force that was, at the drop of a hat, able to detect and defend against land, sea, or air transgressions by a major power, by the Warsaw Pact. That was our experience in the 1990s. I remember as a young gunner officer in Germany, I had 90 days of artillery ammo right at my beck and call, able to sustain a fight in the land domain. And we were practiced in all of that with our NATO partners. At any one moment, year on the land, for example, you would see 250,000 to 500,000 NATO land forces practicing their active defense against the Warsaw Pact, maneuvering through the German countryside, which is kind of extraordinary to imagine today.
Yeah.
That was normal in the 1980s. But we knew why we were doing that. It's because we were there to deter a major power called the Warsaw Pact, who had absolute capability and intent to project its will into NATO territories via land, air, and sea power, if it so chose. And so we never see it manifest, but I'd say in a oversimplified way, deterrence worked. But after the wall came down and the Warsaw Pact collapsed, the West's attitude towards deterrence was, with the exception of some major powers like the U.S. for nuclear deterrence, was really, we had won the Cold War, and now our former adversary were now our potential friends. And so you had the rapprochement with Russia and the invitation of Russia to participate in UN missions with the West in the post-Cold War world, where there was a hope that Russia would actually align itself with the West and no longer be this peer adversary. So the peace dividend of the 1990s in the West saw force reductions across the world. And for Canada in particular, a drastic slashing of forces, including bringing all our forces in Europe back home. Defense policy went from deterring in the 80s to contributions to international peace and security in the 90s. What that looked like was responding to the breakdown of order in states that had formerly been under the lid of the Warsaw Pact or U.S. control. So you had the fight in the Balkans, civil war. You had a fight in Rwanda, civil war. You had a fight in Somalia, civil war. And these civil wars are now not as existential threats to the West, but they're in the interest of the threats of the West to respond to them. For our less for the vital national security interest, more in the national interest versus the national security interest. So we start what we have learned to call contribution warfare in the 1990s. That is, what can we offer into the international order to provide military force to deal with conflict in a place for a specific purpose for a specific period of time. And the dominant role of the Canadian Armed Forces goes from deterring, alongside our NATO partners, a pure competitor, to providing options to government to put Canadian Armed Forces into missions. And those missions start out predominantly as UN. And you'll recall the UN missions had varying degrees of success. And the one in the Balkans, for example, in Bosnia, failed in a way that required NATO to then respond, reasserting military power into peace enforcement versus classic peacekeeping in the mid-1990s. And I found myself actually both in Bosnia, both in the Blue Beret and the failing UN mission, and then back with a green helmet on as part of the NATO military peace enforcement mission in that region. So it was sort of the 1990s. The government, the public, and political attitude was we'd won the Cold War. The policy was to go to missions of discretion and contribution warfare, to use my language. And the level of investment in defense went from being prepared to fight wars to what's our contribution to international peace and security, and what can we get away with? How little can we spend to be seen to be providing a contribution to international peace and security? And I fully bought in, and I still believe in the values we were professing at that time. But we started to forget at that time what the real business of armed forces was to provide for the national defense and security of our nations, and to be prepared and be able to prosecute war if necessary to provide for that security and defense. Our thought about war fighting and warfare started to go away, and we became preoccupied and consumed by contribution warfare. Ships here, 6-pack of F-18s there, a battle group here. And that consumed us because we were shrinking the force. We were scaling down on what the force was going to do. And we were now being driven by discretionary operations versus a baseline of territorial defense and defense of Canada and Canadians in a world that could be at war in the future. So that was the 90s. Changed in the 2000s. We had a bit of a wake-up call with the shocking events of 9/11 and the return to combat as an essential component of our contribution to our own national security interests returned with the commitment of Canada and our armed forces into Afghanistan. And so our contributions now started to include combat and the taking and potential loss of life to advance our national security interests in a region. And we know a lot about, of course, that experience, how we got in, what we experienced, and what it was like when we left. But the major preoccupation of defense policy at the time remained the same. It remained to provide discretionary, just to provide land, sea, and air and other forces as options to government to respond to world crises. And that dominated our period in the 2000s. And we ramped up to be able to do combat in Afghanistan, including investing in air and land capability and power. But we never baselined that investment. It stayed in Afghanistan. It didn't come home to our forces at home. So actually, when we closed out that mission, our armed forces were no longer, say, living as they were fighting in 2010, 2014. They returned to where they were in 2002 and 2001 before the Afghanistan decade took effect. So again, policy was about advancing peace and security in the world. The mission of the armed forces was to provide options to government to deploy forces to areas of interest. But you could put a box around those areas of interest. You could put a time around those areas of interest. You could manage how much you put into those areas of interest. So it's really discretionary to government, and it was contribution warfare for the Canadian Armed Forces. But then the world changed in 2014. and for us, it changed for others way before that when Russia invades Crimea. And the potential to return to peer-on-peer conflict sort of starts to manifest itself. But did government policy change with that? No. How did we respond to the Russian invasion of Crimea? Through contribution warfare again. We sent a 6-pack of F-18s to Romania. We started an enhanced forward presence. We're dealing with Iraq and ISIS breakout in the Middle East and the like. But again, our policy was treating the world as if it was something you could deal with a piece at a time, and our interests were in advancing security somewhere else. They weren't explicitly providing for the vital, the national security and defense of the nation, and the preparedness to deal with a peer competitor who's prepared to use force, land, sea, air, or otherwise, to take on NATO and the West at large. And so really, I think the real wake-up call came with Russia invading the Ukraine 3 years ago, where now the potential for war in Europe became a reality, contained, if you will, by geography, but not contained. And the necessity for the West to actually treat the world like it is and treat our adversaries like they are and as they're becoming went from discretionary and contribution warfare based to actually existential and necessity based. So if I was to summarize all of that in a word or in a phrase, the command sergeant major of the U.S. Army last year was on a podcast, and I heard him say these words: "Over 40 years of service, I have seen a lot of combat, but I have yet to experience war." That is the point. We, in our lifetime, have yet to experience war, and in our contemporary military experience and our government policy, we have never said preventing war is our thing. But the raison d'etre, the core business of armed forces, is to prevent war. And should the deterrence or prevention of war fail, to actually prosecute it and prevail. That has not been the beating heart of government policy or the core raison d'etre of our armed forces since the 1980s. And therefore, we're not equipped for it. We're not prepared for it. We don't have the sustainment base for it. And we, frankly, just as a matter of military thinking, and then the capacity to behave in that way, that the ways of thinking and the ways of behaving where you treat war as the thing you need to be prepared for have atrophied, and they need to be reconstituted in the profession, in the institution, and in policy and program to enable them.
If you had a few minutes with whoever the next prime minister ends up being, what would you want them to understand, and what would you want them to act on immediately?
I'd start off this way. We are living in a world in war, with the real possibility for a world at war. And now is a time as Canada and Canadians to act on this, ideally to prevent war, but if prevention fails, to prevail. That's the idea. And so for Canada and Canadians, the idea of any investment in real and credible deterrence, that is the ability to contribute alongside partners to deterring war between major powers, needs to become the heart of the raison d'etre of our armed forces. We need to be measuring our contribution by the level to which they deter war, and if deterrence fails, our ability to prevail in war with our partners. That's the measure. And so for a prime minister, I'd say, see the world as it really is and it's really becoming. It is major power competition, and it is in all sectors, not just defense. It's social, it's economic, it's informational. But the military arm of power projection by peer adversaries, notably Russia and China, is very real. We need to see that as in its reality and what it's intended to be able to allow them to do. And we need to become effective against that and to prevent that, not on our own, but with our partners. So see it is and as it's becoming. The second thing I said is demonstrate you care. Like demonstrate you get that idea. You see it and you own it. Then with that, commit to investing to perform, not investing to count stuff, but investing to perform. Show me we can do, not to say we can do, show me we can do. And then educate and engage Canadians to understand and get this. If there was ever a moment in time for us to get this, it's now. It's sort of like the Command Sergeant Major of the U.S. Army said, I've seen a lot of combat, but I've yet to experience war. Our ultimate objective is to prevent people experiencing war. The only way to do that effectively is to prepare for it and be demonstrably capable and credible in prosecuting it. Make the pain and the consequence to an adversary too expensive for them to contemplate it. That's our ultimate role and our objective. I'd say own the idea, communicate you get it, and commit and be convicted to actually create our capacity to perform in that regard.
General Stu, as always, appreciate your wisdom, your insights, and thank you so much for being on this special series for the federal election of the NSP.
Thank you, Chris.